My name is Kaylin O'Connor. I'm from the Center for the Study of Social Policy, and I'm very excited to share this work today about Early Learning Nation and how communities can become early learning communities and be part of this growing Early Learning Nation movement. So I first want to give a shout out to our partners and supporters in this work. Early Learning Nation is a project of the Bezos Family Foundation, and they have supported both my organization, the Center for the Study of Social Policy, or CSSP, and our partners at the National League of Cities, or NLC, to carry out this work focused on how individual communities can work to become early learning communities in service of this overall goal of becoming an early learning nation as the United States. So we've been very grateful for the partnership and leadership within these groups to develop all of the materials that I'm going to share today, and we'll talk later about how you can get connected through our organizations and some other partners. So what we're going to cover today is what is an early learning community, the question on everyone's mind, and how you can become an early learning community. We have a roadmap that helps to describe those steps, and then I'll give an overview of this brand new, very exciting digital progress rating tool and how to use it. And I want to start off at the very beginning by answering a question that is often on people's minds, which is, how do we get these materials? They are all available. They're free. The Digital Progress Rating Tool is an amazing resource to be available for anyone to use, and that's thanks to the Bezos Family Foundation. So quell any questions you may have had about how you might pay for this process. There may be costs associated with bringing people together in your community and with implementing the kinds of changes you want to make, but access to the tools themselves is free and will remain free so that you can come to those tools whenever your community is ready to use them. All right, so let's dive in about what is an early learning community. This is a question that we spent some time answering both internally at CSSP and at National League of Cities, and then with some of our partners, particularly those who are working in communities that we thought were already either had achieved the goal of becoming an early learning community or were doing all the right work to get them there. And so we started with a very broad definition. It's a place where all children thrive. And we narrowed that down to 3 specific outcome areas. Pregnant women and young children are healthy. Children live in safe, stable, nurturing families and communities. And children are ready to succeed in school. We've done a lot of other work, as have other partners, about defining indicators within each of these outcome areas and figuring out how we can measure and compare and change those outcomes and metrics. That's not what we're going to focus on today, but I did want to share those outcomes because they are sort of the guiding, we call it the North Star, of what early learning can be all about and why we're doing this work. So from those indicators or outcome areas, we started working with a group of the communities that we convene in a network that we call EC Link. It's called the Early Childhood Learning and Innovation Network for Communities. That's a network of 14 communities across the country that, as I said, are doing a lot of local early childhood system building work, and we're sort of the models we wanted to look to in terms of what other communities might be able to replicate and what we can learn from. And so we started by asking this question: what makes an early learning community? And from that process, we developed a set of building blocks. You can see, actually, in addition to the graphic that's on your screen right now, if you look in GoToWebinar on the panel on the right side of your screen, you can download a handout that's called the Building Blocks one-pager that describes these building blocks. I'm going to cover all the content that's on that handout, but sometimes it's nice to have it all summarized in one place. So feel free to download that and share it with others who might not be able to be on the call today. So each of these building blocks was identified by these participants from our EC Link communities who said, this is a really critical piece of what it means to truly be supporting young children's learning and development. Now you'll see, just as a very superficial look at what these building blocks are, is that it's a lot more than just early care and education. It's more than what we think of as those formal infant, toddler, and preschool settings. It's really about the entire context that children are growing up in, the supports that families have in order to raise the children in the way that they want to. And so we were really trying very intentionally to think broadly from the family's perspective If you're having a baby, what makes a community the kind of place that you say, that's where I want to live to raise my family? And we know that those communities of choice are not just about that there's a really good childcare program or something that we might think of as people in the early childhood field, but it's a lot broader than that. And in some parts of it feel a little bit intangible, but we know how important they are. So I will say, I will go through each of these building blocks in detail, but for now, I just want to point out how broad they are. They go from the leadership and commitment in the community that really makes early childhood feel like a priority, to the quality services that work for all young children and their families, to the neighborhoods where families can thrive, and policies that support and are responsive to families. I will be going through these in detail, but right now I want to note the smaller words at the bottom of the screen about these are themes that you see pop up throughout all of the building blocks, but we wanted to pull them out and especially note them here. The first is equity. In that building block 2, quality services that work for all young children and their families, we really mean all. We don't want to be looking at an early learning community as a place where if you live in the right neighborhood, it's a great place to raise your kids. Or if you have a certain skin tone or educational background, it's a great place to raise your children. We want to think about racial equity, social equity, all forms of equity, so that all families that are raising young children in a community have access to the supports they need and have opportunities so that they can best support their children's development. They wouldn't let us put the word all in much larger font than everything else, but I would have if I could. So then we also have family partnerships as a theme that runs through all of this. It is called out specifically within building block 2 as a way that the services for young children work, which is that they engage families as partners. You'll see that when we look at the building blocks in more detail, but family partnership really runs through every building block, because determining a plan that you want to carry out to make things better for children in your community needs to involve parents being at the table, needs to involve hearing from families about what's not working for them right now and what would work better, what their needs are that people in City Hall might not even be thinking about. We need to have families at the table, have them be part of the decision making, both when it involves their individual child, but also when it involves what's happening for their community as a whole. And the third area that we call out throughout this is a focus on results. So within all of these building blocks, we need to be paying attention to whether what we're doing is achieving what we want it to, and constantly reassessing and changing our strategies if it's not getting us the results we need. And some of those results are tracked in things like public health data, but some of them are, again, not quite as concrete as that. Maybe results being that, well, we planned this big event and nobody showed up. So obviously we didn't plan it with enough community input. We missed something big that was going on that was keeping people from coming, or some other obstacle that we need to think about that. So that's also a way of paying attention to your results and modifying your actions as needed. Before I dive into the actual building blocks, I remembered I wanted to point out a couple things for those of you who might not be as familiar with GoToWebinar. If you have a question, you can type it into the question box and I'll be able to read it later. I will pause occasionally to check for questions, so you can type that in anytime and then I will look and see what's come in. You can also raise your hand, not literally where you're sitting, but by pushing a button on your webinar panel that allows you to raise your hand so I can see that you would like to be unmuted to ask a question or make a comment. So if you're in a place where that's okay noise-wise, you can ask to be unmuted and you can speak and I'll be able to hear you. So when we get to the question time, if you want to raise your hand, I can unmute you. Otherwise, just type your question in as we go and I will come to those as we have breaks for questions along the way. I also want to point out that a little bit later I'll be showing a video, and we've had some issues in the past where people who are connected by phone can't hear the sound with the video. So if you want to switch to your computer speakers for listening to the webinar, that will allow the video audio to play as well. But if that's not an option for you right now, you can go and watch the video. It's on earlylearningnation.com and you'll be able to hear the sound when you go to watch it yourself. So I just wanted to say that now in case while you're listening, you can make that switch from phone to computer. Then you'll be able to hear. I think those were all the notes I had about GoToWebinar. Just want to make sure everyone's comfortable with our platform here, and let me know if you have any questions. All right, so let's dive in on the building blocks themselves. The first building block, as I said, is about community leadership, commitment, and public will. This is one where it felt a little bit less tangible than some of the others that we were looking at, but our community leaders from the EC Link communities really felt that this should come first because it's so critical and foundational for everything else. So what you see we do within each of these building blocks is describe specific targets within that building block. The targets are stated as sort of ideal descriptions of the community that we all want to live in, where all of these things are happening. But I'll go into a little more detail about how we look at what level you might be at related to each of these targets, knowing that there probably isn't a community that's hitting all of these targets right now, but we can all be working toward them as getting as close as we can. The other reason I like the word target is because it's goal-oriented. It's something we're working toward and trying to get as close to as we can. I also heard someone say once, there's a lot of different ways to get to Target, which as a mom who shops at Target a lot, I enjoyed that statement. There are a lot of different ways to get to Target, depending on where you're starting from, and traffic and local conditions and all of that. And just like that, every early learning community might get to these targets in different ways, but we're all working towards those as overall overarching directions. So within building block 1, we have 5 targets ranging from about local leaders coming together across systems with a focus on early childhood, figuring out ways to invest in young children and families. Community members support and understand the importance of early childhood health, learning, and well-being. So that could be about messaging campaigns and getting information out into the community in various ways. Targets 4 and 5 are closely related. 4 is that there's a rich network of informal supports for all families, and 5 is that community resources for children and families are well-known, accessible, and easy to use. Those go together. One is easier to measure than the other because it's hard to know what type of informal supports families have. But the way I like to state these going together is that if you have a 2-year-old who's not speaking yet, you may have a pediatrician or a child care provider who's going to notice that and flag it and do some developmental screening and refer you to somewhere where you can get, identify whether this is a problem and get services if you need it. But if you don't have that yourself, you might have a neighbor who knows that and knows how to find those connections and resources, and you know your neighbor well enough that you bring it up in conversation in the backyard, right? So some of the services that families need, they might get through formal services, but a lot of times it's word of mouth and just having a neighbor or a cousin or another mom at the school who knows something that's available in your community that you might not have been aware of. So both the informal and formal resources are very important for that reason, and informal supports are valuable for a lot of other reasons as well. So just to dig in a little bit on what that looks like within one of these targets, I'm going to zoom in on the first target, which is about local leaders working together across systems. I'm not going to do this for all of the targets, but I wanted to show you how the structure works of what these look like. And you can actually, there's another handout in the handouts panel of the webinar that's called the At a Glance Guide, and that shows all of the building blocks, targets, and the levels within them. But I wanted to use this one to illustrate what the levels really mean. So level 1 for this local leadership target is that a group of stakeholders meets regularly to identify areas of overlap and possible areas of future work. So really the fact that they're meeting is an accomplishment. That means you're at level 1. At level 2, that group of community members and representatives from different organizations and institutions are jointly working toward a shared vision and common goals. So the sort of upgrade from level 1 to level 2 is that you've done the work to identify a shared vision and common goals. When we get to level 3, what you'll see underlined is the dedicated leadership and community input. So this broad group is working together to promote the healthy development of young children. So what we see there is you're going from your baseline of the group meeting to the next step of really having shared vision and common goals, to the third level of working together to get to those goals and having a lot of community input. And there's a lot of things that will come into play as you assess your baseline on that and think about how you could move up a level. Is there an existing group that needs to be strengthened, or are you starting a new one? It's not bad to be starting a new one, because sometimes you can set the tone for a group, really, have a high bar of what that group is going to look like and do, whereas the existing group might say, well, we've been meeting for 10 years and we don't really need to change what we're doing, right? So there's benefits to each of these, but it will affect how you kind of approach how you're going to move up a level. The process of building consensus around a shared vision and common goals is a big one. And so it could take a lot of work to get from that level 1 to level 2. Another critical piece is ensuring community and parent representation. So maybe you have an existing group, but it's all professionals, it's all agency directors, and you don't have parents represented there, you don't have people from different neighborhoods, you don't have direct service providers who serve different communities within your city or county. Then there's also the question of dedicated leadership and sustainability. So is there funding to keep this group going and to staff it and make sure that work gets done between the meetings and all of that? And then the final one, which I've seen a lot of groups struggle with, is that actively working together as opposed to just coming together to share what you're each doing. There is value to sharing what you're doing. I don't mean show and tell to be a negative thing. That was my favorite part of kindergarten, but and we can learn a lot from what other people are doing, and maybe sometimes make a connection that says, oh, can I send one of my staff people to that training you're doing? That would be great. But that's different from really working together to say, I have these resources, I have this space, I know this great person who could come in and help with this project, that can really accomplish a lot more together than just each doing your own good work. So that's target 1.1, and some of what comes into how you think about the differences between the levels and what it might take to move from one to the next. And that pattern applies to other targets as well. So you can see the at-a-glance document in the webinar here, and you'll notice a pattern for many of the targets. Level 1 is kind of about getting the landscape, understanding the needs and strengths and gaps. Level 2 is about implementing solutions to those gaps, increasing your partnership, increasing community engagement. At level 3, you've really got deep community engagement or community ownership of the work. You're addressing disparities and root causes of those disparities, and you're finding sustainable solutions to the challenges you're facing. So I think what I've seen so far, most communities that have embarked on this work are putting themselves at level 1 on a lot of things, which is either we need to do a landscape to understand what's going on, or we have that information, but we haven't yet gotten to implementing solutions. Or folks are at level 2 and they're trying to figure out how do they make that jump to level 3. But a lot of people really are in the early stages of this work and just getting started, which is great, because we want you to have a lot of guidance and support for how you move into the work more deeply. Okay, so let's get back to just reviewing what these building blocks are now that you know how the structure is set up. So building block 2 is about quality services that work for all young children and their families, and this is one where I think our early childhood minds go most easily to think about what services are there. So you see targets 1, 2, and 3 go from the high quality basic services that everyone needs access to, up to screening, identification, referral, and linkage, and then the more intensive services for those who need them. Target 4 is about families and parents being actively engaged as partners. I mentioned that earlier. It runs through all of this, but we do have it there as a specific target. Target 2.5, supports are in place for service providers. So this could mean your work on career pathways and fair compensation. It could also be about infant mental health consultation for providers who are working directly with young children and their families. It could be about training and capacity building at the individual and organizational level for service providers. And then 2.6 is that leaders use data to drive change. So again, really looking at what can we know about what we're doing from available data, what additional data do we need, and what decisions can we make based on the data that we have. Building block 3 is neighborhoods where families can thrive. Here we have just 3 targets, one about the built environment so that it's safe and allowing families to access basic services. This is not saying that every neighborhood in a community needs to have all the basic services, but that you don't want communities that are sort of cut off from the rest of the community, whether that's because of public transportation or lack of safe walking routes, or just, you know, some cities have a highway that cuts a neighborhood off from the rest of the city in some ways, that you need to be creative about how to make sure residents can still get to everything they need to get to. 3.2 is about economic and employment opportunities. So again, not that those are available in every single community, but that residents have access to them. Here we're thinking about banking and jobs and access to education for parents to, you know, improve their financial standing. And then the third one of my favorites and probably one of the least tangible, is residents feel a sense of belonging and hope within their neighborhoods and connection to the broader community. And some of that is about physical neighborhood attributes. So if you're in a neighborhood that's cut off from the rest of the city by a highway, you might not feel very connected to the rest of your community. And when the mayor talks about, we in this city, you know, feel this way or care about this or that, you might not feel like you're included in that. So we want neighborhoods to have that connection to the full rest of the community, and also to feel that sense of belonging and hope that if their neighborhood has challenges, they can come together to fix them, and that they feel like a member of their neighborhood and their community, and that matters to them. And then we get to building block 4, which is about policies. Here we go from policies that govern child and family services. So your child care regulation and licensing rules, your, excuse me, how your 4-year-old kindergarten is set up and doesn't meet the needs of families, all those kinds of things that we want to be implemented in an equitable way and be responsive to family needs. 4.2 is about workplace and other policies that support families in raising children. So we're talking here about things that might be implemented at a city council or government level, but also might just be implemented by different employers, but with support and encouragement from the city. And I'm saying city here, but a community could be at a county level or a region, however you define your community. So with those workplace and other policies, we're talking about things like paid parental leave and sick leave, and what wages people are being paid. Are they supportive of families? The way that people's shifts are scheduled, does it make that impossible for the family to line up childcare in advance? Those kind of things that can be family-friendly policies that a city can support, could implement for their own employees and encourage private employers to do, or that can be implemented at a policy level. And then 4.3 is about land use and community development policies are designed with consideration for how they affect young children and families. So again, trying to think more broadly than just the direct impact, but to say we're considering zoning questions and how does this affect families with young children? How does this affect childcare homes? How does this affect all of these questions that often the question about how this is going to affect children and families is not at the table for some of these other community decisions, but it can be. So those are the 4 building blocks. I'm going to stop for a minute and see if anyone has a question while I take a drink of water. Okay, I haven't seen any questions coming in, so I'm going to keep going about how you actually become an early learning community. Whoops, sorry, my slide's not advancing. There we go. So there are some communities around the country that are already doing this work. They are primarily ones that are attached to EC Link. As I mentioned, that's our early childhood learning and innovation network for communities, which is convened by CSSP, or they are working in a cohort with the National League of Cities with the Institute for Youth Education and Families. NLC has run one cohort already, and a second cohort is going through this process of becoming an early learning nation. We have, with EC Link, several of our communities helped develop these materials. Several of them helped to pilot the materials. They're all working around all of these building blocks in various ways. And then we've got some interesting new partnerships either already underway or developing. So some of you may be attached to Strive Together, Strive partnerships in your communities. We have a cohort of 6 Strive partnerships that are working together to enhance their early childhood work and use the Early Learning Community Action Guide and this progress rating tool to get there. We are also sharing these materials widely with the Campaign for Grade Level Reading members, members of that network, and with the Strengthening Families National Network, which is also convened by CSSP. So these are partners. I'm mentioning these names because you might have folks in your city or your county who are already connected to some of this, and rather than starting from scratch, you might be able to find out that they've also been hearing about this through their network that they're a part of, and you might be able to then figure out more quickly who in your community would want to be part of this and join forces to do the work. So what does it look like to become an early learning community? We developed this roadmap that is an infographic. You can find that on our website, and I'll show you where it shows up in our digital tool as well in a moment. But it walks through these steps that are not rocket science. This is general, what you need to do to get a group of people around a table and work on an issue you all care about. But it does explain how the process works and goes through how to use the actual tools connected with this. So the first step is to assemble stakeholders with an interest in early childhood. So finding those champions and system leaders and service providers, people who can fund the work, making sure that there are parents and community members at the table so that all kinds of perspectives are represented in your group. The second step is to designate a point person. I mentioned this before about that dedicated leadership, because often if we get these groups together and no one's quite in charge, that can make it hard to get work done. Sometimes a decision has to be made. Sometimes the group needs to be reinvigorated, and someone needs to be in charge of making those phone calls and making sure everybody's going to show up at the meeting, and just making sure that things are happening between the meetings. Ideally, that person is also able to either have some funding available to pull for this or to spend some time on seeking funding, because the work does need investment as you go forward. I'll explain later how this works within our digital progress rating tool, but just so you know, one person in the community can be the designated community lead, and then other people who respond to the assessment can do so as stakeholders in the community, and the community lead can see all of their responses. So we did build in that there's a person who's the point person for this work, although we know in reality that might be a shared role in your community, and you might have to both log in as the community lead sometimes. All right, the third step is to assess your community's progress. So we have this progress rating tool. Very excited about the digital version of it that just came out. And we also have a paper version, which you can use if that's better for your community or the group that you want to talk with. The point is to get a sense from multiple perspectives of what your community is already doing well, what level you're currently at, and where you could reasonably take some actions to improve. So we include here that we really want to focus on equity and closing gaps. And that is where doing this work at a community level is much more powerful than an individual agency trying to take on the work. Because when you get perspectives from all around the community, from different sectors, different groups, different neighborhoods, you can find out, oh, we thought this was working really well, but it turns out that a certain language speaking group really needs this and isn't getting it. Or it turns out that one neighborhood or one other group, however we might define it, isn't getting what they need. You're going to find that out when you get the right people answering these questions about what you're doing well, and then you can really focus on those gaps so that something that's happening well in one part of your community can happen well throughout the community. The fourth step is developing an action plan, and the digital progress rating tool drives you toward an action plan, which I think is the most important piece of it, because it really helps you to be clear about what you're going to work on in a designated time frame. You might say, let's just make an action plan that's for the next 6 months, and it'll be things that you know you can get done. Or you might say, let's make a 5-year action plan that includes some things we know we can do right away and some that we know are going to take longer, but we have them on our long-term plan. You can approach that the way that makes the most sense for your community, but having it in writing and attaching the important details to it about how you're going to do it will really help make it real as opposed to just a conversation. The 5th step is to check in with parents and other important stakeholders. And here, of course, I've been saying over and over again that you want parents and other stakeholders at the table throughout, but also recognizing that, you know, you might have 2 parent volunteers who are super engaged and complete the the community assessment and the progress rating tool. But then if you're saying, okay, we know that such and such a neighborhood needs to have more opportunities for infant and early infant toddler care close by that families can get to. You need to talk to the parents in that community, more than just 2 of them, to find out what that needs to look like, right? You need to talk to the providers or potential providers in that community to figure out what that's going to look like. So once you have the action plan, that's going to point you to people you need to talk to more, or where you need a greater sample size, you could say, to inform what you're going to do. And not get too far along in your plan before you really get input from the people who are going to be most directly affected by and participating in what it is that you're trying to do. And the 6th step is to regularly review your progress. So going back to the progress rating tool to see whether your level has improved, or even just going back to your action plan to check some things off as completed and add some new ones. That might be an annual process. It might just be periodic when your group says, you know what, we finished this one thing, let's go back and figure out what we should do next. That's a way to take a step back and say, what do we want to prioritize next? Where have we made progress? Let's celebrate the progress you make, but also be continuously thinking about what you want to do next. All right. What I'm going to do next is show this video. As I said, I'm going to apologize in advance because the sound may not work if you're listening through the phone, and I'm not sure why that is, but it seems to be the case. So I'm going to pull up this video and show it. It's just about 2 minutes long, and then we'll get back to the conversation.
A swing set, a ladder, a lookout tower, a slide. Each has some value on its own, but when thoughtfully assembled with intention and care, they can collectively transform a common space, creating nearly endless opportunities for children to imagine, create, and grow. That's how we think about early learning communities, places that work together to prioritize our youngest and their families from the beginning. These communities put essential building blocks in place to ensure all young children have opportunities to reach their immense potential. That's why we're supporting cities, counties, neighborhoods, and regions across the country to put the pieces together in their own way through continuous and broad participation of local leaders, parents, caregivers, educators, and residents. Developed in collaboration with local stakeholders and national experts, our progress rating tool guides communities on this journey. Organized around 4 building blocks, each assessment in the tool will show local leaders how their current status reflects the experience and desires of different groups within their community. There are 2 slightly different survey experiences, one for a community lead and another for stakeholders. Each community has one designated community lead with the ability to send surveys to other stakeholders, review other stakeholders' responses, and build an action plan based on the community's input. Once started, these assessments save automatically and can be paused or finished later. You can also update or retake your assessments to evaluate your community's progress over time. Based on your survey responses, the tool will provide recommendations that can be assembled in many different ways to fit your community's needs, much like the elements of a playground. With the near infinite opportunities to make meaningful progress, it's important each community choose the actions and assign the local resources, responsible entities, and progress indicators to focus on building equity and closing gaps. Block by block, we can achieve our collective goal of helping the United States become an early learning nation.
Okay, I'm going to keep going to show you the actual digital progress rating tool. So as I mentioned, there is a paper version of this tool that we developed through this process with our EC Link communities and with the communities that piloted the tool, with NLC members, and with some other national experts who weighed in on it. So all of these tools are available as a PDF that you can download, but this digital tool makes it so much more accessible and easy to work through. I want to thank Kelly Hurtado, who just wrote in a comment, "I love this framework." Thank you, Kelly. Nice to know that you enjoy it, and it's nice to see that feedback. You're the first person to type something in, so now I know you're really out there. All right, so with the digital tool, you will see a lot of the content that we've been talking about, but in a format that brings it to the user in a really interactive way. So I'm going to jump to the tool itself. I'll show you how you get there. You just go to earlylearningnation.com and you'll see a familiar video at the top, an announcement of a familiar webinar that's there right now. And you can click on the progress rating tool there, and it'll take you straight to the tool. What you'll see further down is a lot of great articles about work going on in early childhood, different perspectives and news. It's a really great resource. So I encourage you to add that to the list of sites you visit and check it out, but it is also the portal to get to the progress rating tool. So once you're in there, you will come to this lovely page, and I do want to give a shout out to LG&D, the company that designed all of this. They've been great partners in figuring out how to make this huge amount of information very accessible and interactive, and I hope that you all agree. So what you see is all this content we've been talking about pops up as I just scroll down through that main page, and then it comes to the steps that we just went through on that roadmap. And when you come to assess your community's progress, you can click to start the progress rating tool. I will note, if you scroll back up, you can also hit that up here or on the this magic trick, this hot air balloon will always take you into the tool. So I'm going to sign in here as Kaylin stakeholder. So it would have your person's actual name there. And when you come in, you will see that you can go into a survey about each of the building blocks. So what this does in the survey is bring up a number of questions about things that can be going on related to each of the targets within that building block. So here you can see we're in building block 3, that first one about the built environment. So how would you rate your community's progress in listening to families' concerns regarding safety and access to basic services and establishing a cross-sector plan to address families' concerns? Well, you might say that's something we're doing right now, so I'd say we're making progress, but we haven't, we're not fully into it yet. Or you might say we have not even started that. It then jumps you to the next question. So how would you rate your community's progress in understanding which neighborhoods face hazards or lack of access to needed services? And you could say, I think we actually have a pretty good grasp of that. So answer that way. I'm not going to go through a lot of these. Just wanted to show you the variety of questions and sort of how you work through it. Now, when you go back out, what you'll see is that you can see your survey results. You can continue the survey. You can always go back and change your answers as well. And it shows you what percentage you've completed. So building block 1, I've gone in enough times and answered these questions that it's saying I've done it already, but I can see the results. I can also go in and restart the survey. When you go through the survey, when you go to see your results, you can add items to your action plan. So here's an action, of which there was also a reference to in that video, of holding multiple listening sessions across the city or county. This has a lot of detail about what that might look like. You can add that to your advocacy plan, even if that's not exactly how you would want to do that, but it's the concept that you would want to do. And by adding to advocacy plan, that means as an individual stakeholder, you're developing your own plan of what you want to advocate for your community to do. And within the community leads access to this tool, they create the action plan overall for the community, but they can take into account everything that other stakeholders have nominated sort of through their advocacy plan. So what you can see here is where you can add more detail to an item that you've added to your plan. You can add a due date. You can put in a budget. Let's say we have $1,000 we can spend on that. A progress indicator is that it gets announced at the February meeting, And I meant to type in more here, but that you're sending out a survey and getting at least 10 responses, let's say. So you save that. I made a typo, I'll fix it later. You can indicate who's responsible. You can say what programs and resources are contributing to the target. So that might be that, where's the meeting space going to, where's the meeting going to be held? Who's going to provide childcare during a meeting if it's for parents? What other local resources do you still need to figure out? So you can add all of these items, add as much detail as you like. You can also, I should have done this down here. You could add a custom item to your advocacy plan. So there might be something you want to do that's not listed as one of these suggested actions, but you want to say, we're going to do this other thing and hit create action, and that will show up in your plan as well. The other thing I wanted to point out, when you go here to your advocacy plan, it will show you resources that are related to the building block or the target that you're in. So here with this one being, we're in building block 1, there's a toolkit for collaboration from the Friends Resource Center that you can click that link and go straight to it. There's a community toolbox from the University of Kansas. There's making network-based strategy work. We've got some tools here that you can use to go deeper to look at how well leaders from other sectors are engaged in early childhood work. That takes you to a specific tool to dig in more on that. Then there are also some tips that help, just things that our community leads suggested might be useful for someone who's thinking about these types of actions. And then view an example. So this one is about early childhood work in Dayton, Ohio, with a short but detail-rich explanation of how one city already did this work that you're interested in. So you can print your advocacy plan. You can save that as a PDF. We're working on getting the system to where community leads will be able to see stakeholders' action plans, but for right now, the best bet is to save it as a PDF and send it to your community lead or bring it to a meeting if you print it out. So it prints out with all the details you entered as well as those resources that were listed at the bottom. And then it goes into the next building block where I had just added one thing to the plan and not put details with it. It still prints that out along with the resources that go with it. So you can print that as a takeaway from what you've done in the tool. So I saw one question came in. I'm going to go back to our slides. One question came in about who would be the appropriate person to respond to that tool. Really, it could be just about anyone who has an interest in early childhood in your community, but how you approach it might vary for your community. So I'm actually going to go to my next slide, which kind of gets at this. You might have a group who are, the agency leads for your, someone who runs the largest childcare center in your town, and someone who's from Head Start, someone who's from the public school system who focuses on early childhood, someone from birth to 3, someone from a home visiting program, someone from public health, maternal child health, and you might be the ones who are each going to complete this tool. Or you might each say, I'm going to ask 3 or 4 people in my circle to complete this tool so that we get the actual home visitor, not just the director of the home visiting program. And maybe we get a participant in a home visiting program, or we get a parent who's participating in birth to 3 services, or however that might be, that you can kind of roll it out to different groups. So there's no limit on the number of stakeholders you can have complete this. And the other thing I'll say is there might be some audiences you want to reach that aren't going to go through the tool and complete it, but you can go talk to them about all the building blocks or about one particular building block that they might have a lot of input on. So for example, if you had an opportunity, you're taking on this work for your community and there is a children's hospital in your city that says you could come talk to the pediatricians, at some meeting. That's a great opportunity. I do not recommend that you say, great, I just need every pediatrician to complete these surveys, because that's probably more than you can ask of that group. But you might be able to go there and say, let's talk about building block 2. Let's talk about how families are coming, getting basic services and how your referral and identification and linkage is working to get families more help when they need it. And that's a conversation you can have that then you could either fill out the tool based on, answering the questions that you talked about with them, with their perspectives in mind, or just, get some action steps from them that are going to come into your action plan, or just be more informed about how that group in your community might approach these questions. The other thing I would add is that, excuse me, if you have a number of parents who you want to get input from, some parents might be up for completing a building block survey or all of the building block surveys, but you might, again, prefer to do it in a conversational mode. And we actually had that request from some of the communities who are doing it right now. So I'm working on a parent discussion guide that kind of has questions related to each building block, but doesn't go into as much, doesn't go through every single target, to have a conversation about what's affecting families related to each of these building blocks that, again, can inform your action plan, even if they might not have the time or literacy level or whatever to complete the online assessment. That might work for your professional audiences more than for a parent group. The other thing I'll mention related to that is that, unfortunately, we don't have these materials in any language other than English, but the parent discussion guide will be translated into Spanish, so that if you had a Spanish-speaking group of parents or providers that you wanted to just have this conversation with, we will have tools available to support that really soon. And we know that there are, a lot of other languages that could also be needed, and this is just a huge amount of content to translate. So we're focusing on ways that we can more efficiently get the conversation to groups that speak other languages, and would welcome your thoughts on that. So we've got some questions coming in about how to access the progress rating tool and whether it's available for everyone. So it is indeed available for everyone. Let me actually, I'm going to go to the next slide, and then because these questions have just come in, and then I'll come back to where I just was. So any community can set up an account on the progress rating tool. What you need to do, if you are the community lead, or if you know who should be the community lead, that person needs to go in and request approval to be a community lead. Then you can set up your community that other people, when they come in as a stakeholder, will be able to attach to that community. So that first step you can't do immediately. You can request the access, and we try to approve those as quickly as we can. And then once that's set up, you get a link that you can send to other stakeholders in your community to respond to the surveys. If you just want to go in because you're curious, but you're not quite ready to make that commitment, or you aren't sure you should be the community lead, but you want to see what it's all about, you can go in and create an account as yourself. Don't request to be a community lead and just attach to demo community for kids, which is the one that I was just responding to that you could see. So it'll ask you what community you're a part of, and there will be a list of the registered communities. So you can attach to the demo one until, if at a later point you decide that your community is really going to go in and do it. Okay, I'm going to go back to my previous slide because I wanted to touch on a couple other things about using the tool. My general recommendation is that you go block by block. So you would be sending that link out to your stakeholders and saying, please complete the survey for building block 1. And then we'll talk and we'll come back together, and then we'll do building block 2 next. Partly because it might just be too much all at once to ask of people, and people might get overwhelmed and stop. But also because I think you can kind of separate out your planning. What we have communities doing in one of the cohorts we're working with right now is having a draft action plan that they're adding to as they do each building block, and then they'll come back to review the whole thing. And it might be that they came up with too many actions overall, so they're going to trim it down or time things out, space things out, what they're doing when, but just kind of building it as they go, but doing it block by block. Now, in other places, it's more of a divide and conquer. So you might have a group of 20 people and you say, okay, 5 of us are going to do each building block, and you're going to go in and do that and then come back together and look at what you all did. But that's kind of a way to get it all done quicker, but without having everyone's input on every building block. One of the things you want to pay the most attention to is where stakeholders are rating things differently. So sometimes And I'll use the most common example would be that the parent or community member's perspective is very different from the policymaker or agency lead, right? Because the agency lead says, yes, our budget says we are carrying out something that looks a lot like this, so I'll say we're doing it well. And the parent has no idea that that is happening, either because it's not actually happening, or because it's happening in a very limited part of the community that this parent hasn't heard anything about it, or it's available but it hasn't been advertised well, or maybe it's happening but it's not meeting what that parent would consider needs to be done to meet that need. So that's an opportunity for conversation. Hopefully it's not a adversarial conversation. It's just to go into it with curiosity and say, well, why is it that some people feel we're doing this really well and some people don't see that happening, or think that what's happening is not meeting the need it should? And that opens up a lot of potential action plans items, which could range from we need to market the fact that this resource is available to we need to really rethink what we're trying to do to meet families' needs in this way because it's not meeting the needs that they feel they have. So those differences are your places to pay a lot of attention. And then I do recommend identifying a smaller set of action steps, not every possible thing that everyone wants to do, because that quickly becomes overwhelming and then you end up maybe not doing anything. So focus on a smaller number so you can really do them well, and assign those responsibilities and timeline and resources and a progress indicator so you can say, oh, we were going to have this step done by March and we're not there yet, so we need to adjust our plan. So to really be conscientious about it. Okay, I know we're coming to the end of our time soon, so I want to make sure that we have covered everything on here. I think we have covered what I wanted to here. I want to see about other questions, but I also want to take a moment because I know that Megan Wyatt is on the line, and she is our program officer at the Bezos Family Foundation, and she wanted to say a few words. So Megan, I'm finding your name so that I can unmute you. Here we go. Megan, are you there?
Yes, how's the audio?
You sound great.
Awesome. Well, I just wanted to say how thrilled we are that this digital tool is out there and available to communities. We were in a really fortunate position to be able to support it, but it was totally community driven, from the beginning. So it was such an honor to be champions of this work. And really what motivated the creation of the tool was a groundswell that we were seeing in the number of communities, cities, counties, regions that were making early childhood well-being central to their efforts. And we heard that they wanted a way to think about success broadly. We heard communities wanting to learn from each other, whether you were in rural Nebraska or LA County. There's a lot of value in connecting with each other. And so really that's what this whole platform and initiative is about. And finally, I wanted to just thank our partners, the National League of Cities, CSSP, and Kaylin personally for the effort that went into this. Every word, every feature was considered very carefully, and I think it shows in the final product. So we're thrilled to see how this tool works, who uses it, and what it leads to. So great webinar. We're so excited about the tool, and thanks for the opportunity to join today.
Thank you so much, Megan. It's really been a fun project, painstaking at times, but a lot of fun to really think about what communities need and how they can do this work, come together and do the best they can for young kids and their families. So thank you. We have not had any other questions come in so far, so I'm just going to point out, if you're still typing, type quickly so I see your question before we get to the end of the hour. But I will point out that we have some additional handouts and other supporting materials on our website at cssp.org. And as I mentioned, there's a PDF version of all this content, which might be right for your audience or your community. Although we love the digital tool, we know some people need something to hold in their hands, and so you can print things off from there. You can also sign up for our EC Link newsletter, where we focus on local early childhood system building and share resources and highlight things that our members of our EC Link network are doing that you can always learn from and try to replicate in your community. So I encourage you to do that. If you go to cssp.org, on any page, you can scroll down to the bottom and click on Stay Connected or something like that, some words like that, and that then takes you to a page to choose which newsletters you'd like to receive. And of course, as I pointed out earlier, the Early Learning Nation website is chock full of resources and your way to get to the progress rating tool as well. So please do check that out, share it widely with other folks in your community. The other thing I'll say is that our partners at National League of Cities work with mayors' offices and with city council members. So in your city, if your mayor or your city is a member of the National League of Cities, there may be opportunities for them to learn more about Early Learning Nation and how to become an early learning community through NLC. So if you have that connection in your community, you might want to make that. Otherwise, there are lots of great partners that you can reach out to. The communities that have been piloting this, it's been housed in First Five organizations in California counties, United Ways in some places, Children's Services Council, Early Childhood Coordinating Council. They go by different names. They're all doing great work and are wonderful partners to connect with if you want to start doing this for your community. So I think we will wrap up because I don't see any further questions coming in. I just want to thank you from CSSP. You can see our information here. If you're interested in learning more about what we do overall, we don't just focus on young children and their families and local early childhood systems. We've got a lot of other great work going on as well. So follow us on social media, check out our website, and thanks everyone for joining us today. It's been a pleasure, and I hope that a lot of you will make use of these tools. Thank you.